Now, punishment is very different from discipline. Discipline really is about the values. The methods are just tools to get us to the end point. Children are more outspoken about their own thoughts, their own ideas. They may ask questions. They may challenge you as a parent. We don't just want children who fear us. We want children who respect us. I think it's also important to confront the fact that not all practices were helpful forms of discipline. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of your favorite podcast, Diaspora and Mum. The podcast where we talk about all things parenting from the perspective of those of us who parent away from our home countries where we grew up in. Now, parenting is a journey, but when you have to do it in an entirely new culture, that adds another layer. So here at Diaspora and Mum, we create a space for us to learn together so that we can raise children who don't just survive, but thrive. And today, we are going to talk about a topic that so many of us have struggled with. In fact, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, it is this: how do I discipline my child? How do I make them learn the boundaries I am trying to teach them? How do I ensure my children are respectful? Discipline. Discipline is one of the biggest challenges that most parents face. And it's a challenge on different levels. Because most of us, all of us, but I'll say most of us, when that little bundle is put in our hands, this love flows out from us that makes us say, look, nothing must harm this child. So the first challenge about discipline is, how do I do something that makes this person who is my heartbeat upset? For some of us parents, we struggle with that. How do I get my child? How do I deny my child something when I know that they are upset because of what I am doing? And for others, it's the other way. How do I ensure that this child that I have is a respectful, responsible member of society? How do I not make this love that I have for them become something, quote unquote, that spoils them? And that is a tricky balance for us parents that we face. And I know that a lot of us have heard these phrases. Some people will say, oh, you are too soft as a parent. Others will say, you are too strict as a parent. So where is the right balance between loving our children, but also creating appropriate boundaries for them so that they can become the kind of grown adults that we will be proud of, that they will be proud of, that will make them functional citizens in society? Now, I wish I could tell you that I have the answer, because if I did, I would have bottled it and I would have come rich many years ago. I don't think anybody has that, bottled up, because every circumstance is different. Our environments are different. Our family contexts are different. In fact, the children, each child is different. If you're a parent of 2, 3, 4 children, you will know this, that they all have their particular character traits, and that what works for one may not necessarily work with the other. For one child, you may just need to have a look and they will listen. For another one, you'll have the look, nothing happens. So, how do we balance all of that in our parenting journey for discipline? And then as diasporan parents, that added layer of how do I discipline in a culture that I do not fully understand? How do I ensure that my discipline makes my child whole without making me susceptible to perhaps some of the rules, laws, practices in this new environment that I am in? So that's what we're going to be looking at today. But the first place to start is to talk about what is discipline. Now, I know that in some of our cultures, we use the words punishment and discipline interchangeably. But I'm sure most of us have come to understand that in this new culture that we're in, that punishment is very different from discipline. And in fact, sometimes when we misuse the words, it partly creates the challenges that we have with authorities, with the welfare system and the like. So let's start by talking about what discipline is and what it isn't. Now, punishment is about consequences for an action that you pay for. So when you say I punish somebody, I want to make you pay for something that you have done. Discipline is not about paying for something. Discipline is about learning from something. So if something happens, how do I make sure that my child learns from this so that they can learn the values that I want to teach them? So discipline really is about the values. The methods are just tools to get us to the end point. I want to teach my child kindness. I want to teach my child gratitude. I want to teach my child cleanliness. I want to teach my child proper boundaries. I want to teach my child hard work. I want to teach my child ambition. All of those really good stuff that we want to teach our children. And of course, because children, they are learning from us, oftentimes they push against those because the boundaries that we are setting them means that they cannot have quick gratification, and they don't like that. So how do we make sure that we teach them so that they take on these values that are necessary for them to be effective members of society? From many of the cultures we come from, African, Caribbean, Middle Eastern, Asian, there are certain methods that we've come to recognize as part and parcel of the expectation, the boundaries that are set for us, and therefore where discipline may usually originate from. So, for instance, we expect in some of these cultures for children to speak politely to elders. We expect children to recognize the authority of their parents, not as something that is quote unquote earned, but as part of the hierarchies in the societies that we come from. Now, in the culture that we brought our children to, sometimes you find that in these cultures, children are more, if you like, outspoken about their own thoughts, their own ideas. They may ask questions. They may challenge you as a parent. You know, one of the things that I learned very quickly is, why? Mom, why? And that was also the question that I necessarily asked when I was growing up. But that question, why? How do you deal with that? But the important thing, as I said, is the understanding that what we are trying to do is pass on the value of respect, the value of hard work, without necessarily, you know, doing it exactly the same way that it was done when we were growing up. Now, why do I say that? It's because when I was growing up, sometimes all your parent had to do was look at you and you got the message, you know, and sometimes sarcasm was actually a normal way of training up a child. So if my mom had asked me to bring water, or my dad or an uncle, whatever, and I brought the water, there's a stool, and they say, here's your water, where do you want me to put it? They'll say, put it on my head. Put it on my head. Now, what that simply means is, are you silly? Can't you see the stool? You put the water on the stool. Now, that kind of way of teaching is what was common when I was growing up, and immediately you will get it that, oh, I've asked a stupid question, or I've asked a silly question, and you put the water where it ought to be. But what we must recognize is that our children may not necessarily understand those nuances about the cultures in which we grew up in. And therefore, one of the questions we want to ask ourselves is, the kind of support system that existed in my culture, the broader understanding in that wider culture, are my children exposed to that as well in the diaspora? If not, can I discipline, can I teach in exactly the same way? Or do I have to learn new ways, new method of passing on the same values? Because as I said, the values are the important thing. What we want is our children who learn these values for use, not just in the immediate, but later on as they become responsible adults. We don't just want children who fear us. We want children who respect us. So, what are some of the ways in which, as I said, I've talked about one, just the look. Another thing that was very common was threats when I was growing up. So, if you do not do that, what I will do to you. Now, 99% of the time, parents did not follow through with that. It was just a threat. The threat was enough. But that threat could be misunderstood in the cultures that we are now in. And even your child may misunderstand that threat because it is not part and parcel of the wider environment that they are growing in. So as we think about discipline, in this new environment, those are some of the things that I just want us as parents in the diaspora to think about. How can I parent? How can I discipline in this environment? Pass on my values. Make sure that my child becomes a thriving citizen without breaking them. Now, having talked about, culturally, the ways in which culturally we may have discipline, I think it's also important to confront the fact that not all practices were helpful forms of discipline, regardless of the culture, whether that be African culture, Asian culture, European culture. Not all practices are helpful. And as parents, we must learn and understand where it stops being helpful and to ask ourselves, this particular practice, is it passing on the values? Is it helping my child to be a healthy citizen? So, for instance, there are ways in which we're disciplined that can be interpreted as maybe undermining the esteem of the child. Children could be shamed, for instance, into obedience. Was that helpful? Or practices that could have been humiliating to a child. Was that helpful? If what we do to our children is only about making the children obey in the moment while they resent us longer term, then that is not an appropriate method of discipline. If we discipline a child and the child becomes resentful long term, then something went wrong in that process and we need to reconsider that. And so, in thinking about that then, what are some of the ways in which we can discipline our children in these cultures while we celebrate the positive aspects of our culture? The past, I want to say, yes, that was something that happened when I was growing up. I wanted to learn that as well. And what are some of the things that we want to drop along the way? Now, in navigating that, some of it's about the boundaries that we actually set. What is an appropriate boundary and what is an appropriate boundary? Because remember, what was appropriate when you were a child may no longer be appropriate now for your child in this century, in this decade, because times change, times move on. Remember, even as a child, you also challenge some of the boundaries that were set for you by your parents. So understand that some of those have changed in the context that your children now live in as well. So what is healthy discipline? Healthy discipline is about ensuring that your child understands why what they have done is wrong and why they need to adapt that behavior. That is healthy discipline. What you did is not acceptable. This is why it is not acceptable. Because I have told you this before. Because you understand this and you still did it. This is the consequence. And as I said, that consequence will have to be age appropriate. And in order for us to do that, let us remember that we must set clear boundaries for children. We cannot expect them to know what is in our mind if we haven't had a conversation with them first about what the boundary is. So, if you've never told your child, for instance, that 8:30 is bedtime, and you kind of suddenly just wake up and say, why are you awake at 10 o'clock? Well, you never told them before that they should be in bed by 8:30. If you've never set a boundary for your child that you need to study for an hour a day, you can't wake up one day and get very frustrated that they are not studying. If you've never told them that their curfew for coming home is 7 p.m., you can't then get angry about that. So you have to set the boundaries for them, what is acceptable and what isn't. If you've never told them that if they want to go and visit a friend, they need to first let you know, then you cannot get angry. So the first step to proper discipline is that we have healthy conversations that set clear boundaries. The next thing we want to do is that we want to be consistent in those boundaries and consequences. Because if we're not consistent, what we're telling our children, we're sending them mixed messages. We're telling them the boundaries were not important in the first place. And who knows, the consequences may not happen. And that is not helpful. It doesn't teach the values that we originally wanted to teach them in the first place. The next thing we want to do is that we want to ensure that our children understand that whilst we discipline them, we still love them. That we are still their place of safety. That no matter what they do, you remain their parent, you love them regardless, even if you do not like what they did. Now, what that ensures is that actually as children grow older, they trust us and they can come to us with the challenges that they face, even when they've made mistakes. We find that a lot of the time, children's first mistake isn't catastrophic. Oftentimes, it's them trying to resolve that without going to talk to somebody, an adult, a parent, that results in bigger consequences for them. So we want to teach our children that whilst we discipline you because of this, it's just to show you healthy boundaries, but that we love you regardless, and whatever you do, we will still love you. We don't want children to be frightened of us and being unable to come and speak to us as their parents. Now, I know some of you may then ask me, listen, all this when you're speaking is grammar. My 2-year-old, I can't get them to listen to me. Or my 15-year-old, I have reached my boundaries. They don't listen to anything I say. As I said earlier on, I wish I could bottle, there's a solution. If you put A and B together, then you get C. Unfortunately, I can't. But there are some tools that we can learn early on, or even if not early on, that we can begin to utilize. I've already talked about one of them. It's about creating spaces of safety for our children, where they know that we love them regardless, and that what we want is for their best interest. Let them trust that. I think that's important. The other thing is that for each child, as I said, it's different. Different children will respond to different things. Some children will respond to, for instance, depending on the age of the child. So let's say it's a 15-year-old. Some children will respond to being grounded. Some will respond to being asked to do something that contributes value. Some may respond, for instance, to an activity that is restorative. Whatever that is, we'll have to find that out with each of our children. But always note for your children that the consequences is about their behavior, that it is not about them. Because sometimes our children act up because they think, well, whatever I do, you're not going to love me anyway. You don't like me at all anyway, so I'm going to do what I want to do. So if they understand that actually when they do something good, that's something else I wanted to talk about. When they actually do the right thing, compliment them, appreciate them, give them rewards for the good things they do. And I know that this is difficult for some of us, because why did I reward you for what you ought to do anyways? Who rewarded me when I was growing up? But it doesn't mean that because it wasn't done for you, it may not work for this particular child. So seek reward systems that may be helpful. And reward doesn't necessarily mean money. Reward may even be time with you. Sometimes all our children really want is a bit more time with you. They want to watch a movie with you, especially younger children. They want you to go to the park with them. So look for a reward system that works for you and your children and your family. And always make sure that if you are feeling extremely frustrated, that you delay discipline. And we all do. We all feel frustrated. We all feel overwhelmed. We all feel stressed once in a while. When you discipline out of frustration, more often than not, we do not send the right message. We do not use the right method. And that takes over. And we lose the essence of why we wanted to discipline in the first place. And finally, regardless of whatever method of discipline we use, always look for repair. I have known situations where parents keep their kids on tenterhooks endlessly for days. Maybe it works for some people, I don't know, but it would not be what I would do. Discipline is always about repair. This happened, this is a consequence, I love you anyway, let's carry on. Let children understand that love continues regardless of discipline. If it's a younger child, bring them back after a few minutes, hug them, give them a kiss, I love you. that does a whole lot more than keeping them for a long time, because after that, the child pulls away and we lose the essence of what we were trying to do in the first place. And what about when you get it wrong as a parent? Because sometimes we get it wrong. We may think that our child had behaved in a particular way. We reacted before we found out the full facts. Or we disbelieved them, which happens, and later we heard that actually they were telling us the truth. How should you respond? Because this goes both ways. If children do not understand from you that you are able to accept when something has gone wrong and to repair that as well, then why should they trust you when you discipline them? So, I don't know, again, culturally that may be difficult for some of us, but if you've got it wrong, there is nothing wrong with calling your child and saying, look, child, I'm really sorry. This is what I thought. This is what happened. I was wrong. And I apologize to you. There's nothing wrong with your parent apologizing to a child in a healthy relationship. And in most situations, I believe that will make our children actually respect us more and help them also to concede when they've done the wrong thing and also apologize wholeheartedly. Now, the final part I want to talk about is the triggers, the challenges that we sometimes face as diaspora parents with the system, whether that be with the school system or with the welfare system, because of some of the practices that we may think are culturally appropriate, but are not necessarily appropriate in the new environment that you're in. So the first thing I will tell you is, please make sure that you understand what is acceptable or not in your new environment, because that's what causes friction or problem. So I'll tell you an example. There was a particular situation with a child. The parent has used threat as a form of discipline. The child was going to school, he was a younger child and always getting themselves wet and coming home. And the parent had said, the mom had said, look, if you come home again and you're wet, I am going to whatever. And then the child went to school and repeated that. When the teacher asked her to play with water. And because of the language that was used, that was threatening, services were called in. Now, this was a parent who had never harmed their child. They never hurt their child. They just used what was culturally normal to them to use threat as a way of teaching and of discipline. And in this instance, it backfired. So I always say it's really important to learn what is culturally appropriate, what is legally appropriate in the environment that you currently live in. And that is whether you agree with it or not. And that some of us may say, look, I don't agree with that. I think this is too, permissive. It doesn't matter. If legally that is what is acceptable in your current environment, please, for the health, safety, unity of your family, you need to abide by those. And remember that even when you disagree, these agencies are actually there to protect your children. They are there to support your children. So while sometimes, and a lot of the time this happens, they may misunderstand you, they may misunderstand your culture, they may misunderstand your practice. Find ways of effectively engaging. Have conversations with your child's teachers. Talk to them about your style of parenting. Talk to them about the value that you're trying to inculcate. Ask them if they have any issues with that. Have those open conversations, and you'll find that will more often than not lead to not having consequences through the system. Also, please listen to your child. Sometimes we jump to conclusion as parents, and we kind of take the side of authority figures because we're used to respecting authority and the like. And that may not be your child's experience. So please always listen to your child. Make sure that you get to the bottom of a matter before you make decisions. Don't make speedy decisions when you do not truly understand the full context. As I said, the services are there to support you. If you have any challenges or issues with them, have those conversations with them. And I want to specifically talk about physical discipline. What some of us call corporal punishment or corporal discipline in the societies that we grew up in. Now, across the world, all cultures once used physical discipline as an appropriate form of discipline. But so many societies, especially in the global north, are moving away from that. And whether it be smacking or whatever we want to call it, please understand where those boundaries are. Some people will tell you that it is not appropriate at all in any circumstances whatsoever. Some people will tell you that light smacking is okay. Now, I'm not going to make rules for anybody as a parent. You understand what is best for your child. But do understand that corporal punishment is, in most societies in the global north, unacceptable. And therefore, you have to learn to deal with that. And so, what are some of the ways that you may discipline? There are different methods. You could ground a child. You could take away a benefit. So if they had, for instance, pocket money, you could take that away. You could ask them to, like I said earlier on, support some initiatives. You could ask them to take on a bit of support for the hope. Whatever you could set up a reward system for younger children. You could get them to do things together with you. There are a range of practices that we can adopt to help us set proper boundaries for our children without having to use physical discipline. Now to close. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about discipline. We've talked about the challenges of disciplining your child. We've talked about how that is the added layer where you're in a different culture. We've talked about the values that you want to pass on and how methods can change but values remain the same. We've talked about understanding the law in the society, the culture in the society that could now lead in, if you're living within the boundaries. We've talked about evaluating your own practice, how you were disciplined. Do you agree with all of them? If you actually reflect, you find out that you did not agree with every single thing. So what do you want to drop? What do you want to take forward? You know, what is actually going to be helpful in helping my child navigate this world as an effective contributing member of society? And that's what you're ultimately trying to do. Some of the things I've talked about today will be helpful in supporting you in that journey. And at the back of your mind, please always remember that what you're trying to ask yourself is this helping my child become the kind of adult I want them to be? Not whether they're afraid of me in the moment. Well, not whether they are compliant in the moment. You have to think about your child's long-term mental health. You have to think about how they fit into society that they now belong in. You have to think about the support systems that may or may not exist in the societies that we now live in. And then consistency, boundaries, consistency, boundaries, conversations, repair, letting your child know that you love them, letting them know that you are their place of safety, letting them know that they should never be too afraid to talk to you about the things that matter. Because if they are not talking to you, they are talking to somebody else, and they may get the wrong type of advice that could get them into deeper problems as young adults. Now, I've covered a lot of ground here, and as I said, this is one question that none of us has the right answer to. It will be helpful to all of us in this community if you could please share your own thoughts. What has worked for you? Do you have a 2-year-old? Did you try something? Did it work? Please just put it down in the comment section, because what we want to do is to learn from one another. And hopefully, something you say can help somebody, and something they say may help you. So please, leave your comments behind. If you have any questions, put them in the question box. And if you've not already done so, please subscribe, like, share. And until next time, stay safe and hold close the loved ones. Bye-bye.